Greetings and welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Nick Stern and my guest today is Dr. Lyal White, the Director of the Center for Dynamic Markets at the Gordon Institute of Business Science in South Africa. Dr. White, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.
So just to start, I wonder if you could tell my viewers a little bit about what dynamic markets are.
So dynamic markets is our version of what was formerly known as emerging markets to the world at large. At Gibbs, we're doing a lot of research on the rise of alternative markets or economies, but not based purely on size, economic growth rates, or demographics, but looking at other issues around that shape and inform the economic potential of countries. Things like institutions and the role of institutions, political stability, social stability, culture, those issues, and also very importantly, how some of these countries that are changing. It's in the word or in the form of dynamic markets. They are changing. They are progressing for the better. How they are now bringing in an enabling environment for business and innovation, which makes them truly dynamic.
I was wondering if you could give us maybe an example or two of a country you think is a really dynamic market, and maybe some of the factors that are making it so dynamic.
Okay, so what we're doing at the Gordon Institute is we're building a dynamic market index, and we're going to be ranking these countries. I know there's a number of rankings of emerging markets around the world, but this one will be slightly different. And what we're looking at are those countries that are changing rapidly for the better, and the countries that really come to the fore are the unlikely ones. Countries like Mozambique, which is a tiny African economy, probably most commonly known here in the United States for swollen-bellied children and poverty and the war that enveloped the country from 1975 to 1995. Today, Mozambique is one of the best or most attractive investment destinations on the African continent. It's got enormous coal deposits. It's got huge gas and oil deposits up in the north. But what is very interesting is that it's got this demographic energy, this population that is now coming to the fore, and this population that is looking at each day with a lot more hope and looking at how they are going to contribute to the economic prosperity of the country. Mozambique is definitely one. If you look at it on the Asian side, Myanmar is, or Burma is one of those that we would also look at very, very closely, and obviously the likes of Indonesia. Every year I look at the countries and in a very kind of qualitative way, or just from my own personal experience from traveling around the world, I decide on which was my dynamic market of the year. And in 2011 going into 2012, it was Turkey, and I think this really represents what we mean by dynamism. Turkey is a country that came to the fore. It was a feasible alternative to the Arab Spring, a secular state if you like, one that grew by 7.5%. Its companies like Koch started expanding and investing across the world, especially in African markets, and it really took a leadership role in the region vis-a-vis what was happening in the Middle East, but also Syria. So things like geopolitics, international relations, and their influence in the world is as important as the economic trajectory of these countries.
Now, you touched briefly on the concept of demographic energy or population energy. Could you go a little more in depth into what really you're talking about there?
Yeah, so demographic energy, or what is commonly known as the demographic dividend, is one of the key kind of drivers in these popular these popular forecasts for countries like dynamic markets, or what some of the investment banks are calling emerging markets. They really suggest that countries that have a very young population, a burgeoning middle class, are going to be driving economic growth through consumerism and through a labor market, a very large labor market. Now, Africa, for example, is probably the most exciting demographic story of the future. Obviously, these do come with a number of challenges, and we can go into that around urbanization and the management of cities and services that have to be catered for, which are not catered for at the moment. But let's just look at the upside for now. When we talk about demographic energy, we talk about two things: the consumer markets, or the market of the future, and the labor force. And in Africa, where about 60% of the population, probably just more than 60% of the population, are below 30 years of age, that means the future of Africa is very, very positive in terms of those markets and the labor force. In 2035, Africa will have the largest labor force in the world. It will surpass China and India, and it will have the largest labor force and probably start entering into that middle income category of regions, which bodes very, very well for consumer companies and individuals in that consumer product industry.
Now, I'd love to talk a little more about Africa. It seems that with some of the growth rates you're seeing, Africa has largely managed to avoid the effects of kind of the worldwide economic crisis. Can you talk about some of the reasons why that happens to be?
Well, these are probably twofold. One of them is definitely by chance, and the fact that and African history, the fact that Africa was largely what we call disconnected from the rest of the world, despite what some of the pundits like Thomas Friedman and others have written about the world is flat. The world is still very disconnected and less globalized than what we imagine. Africa is one example of this. We see intra-regional trade and the connectivity with the rest of the world being less than about 11 or 12% of total trade. And where this relates to the global financial crisis is that Africa is not or was not trading as much with the likes of Europe and the United States as many had thought. It also, very importantly, wasn't attracting as much capital. So when the financial crisis struck, and it started in 2008, 2009 and spread across to Europe, Africa was less affected because it was less reliant on that capital. And it had also started decoupling its economies, the African economies, from the Western and Northern so-called economies to those in the East. Obviously, very importantly, China. Today, China is Africa's largest trade partner, and that kind of helped buffer the process. So yeah, this is a twofold story. One with the fact that it's not as connected to the US and European markets as we might have thought, and the fact that it hasn't got as much capital coming from those countries. And the other one is that it has decoupled and gone to the east. But also, very importantly, in terms of economic policies, African economic policies, and this goes along with fiscal policies and political policies, have become a lot more transparent and a lot more rigid in this ability to withstand these types of kind of ebbs and flows and tumultuous times that we're actually seeing in the global economy at the moment.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the real opportunities you see for growth, if you see any specific markets or areas that you think in Africa have a really bright future.
Yeah, so the mention of demographics and the future of consumerism in Africa is obviously the big story that's to come, and we've seen this in publications from the transaction advisory firms like E&Y and McKinsey, and that's really going to be the big story: is the burgeoning middle class in Africa. But to emphasize a point is that Africa is not quite there yet. We are not quite in the same category as perhaps China and even India at this stage in terms of the middle class. So that's probably going to be the story of the future. The story of the present in Africa is still very much around natural resources. And even though African governments and by and large African companies across the continent are trying to diversify the economies to look more into non-traditional sectors like manufacturing, areas of perhaps telecommunications, tourism, these are still on their way. But to answer your question, then the real opportunities I see lie in trying to overcome those problems of connectivity that I mentioned earlier. Those individuals, those companies that help bridge the divides, that help connect African countries, that build infrastructure, that help extract those natural resources, that's where the huge opportunities will lie for the next 5 to 10 years. And then following that will be the market forces that will come into play in terms of consumerism and exciting prospects. If you look at it geographically, I tend to, at the end of 2012, I highlighted my 5 countries of the year in Africa to look at. And these would have been, in no particular order, but Nigeria, Ghana, both in West Africa. West Africa is an incredibly exciting region at the moment. East Africa, we're looking at Ethiopia, which has got a population of nearly 100 million people, 75% of which are under the age of 30. Kenya, which is my truly dynamic market of Africa, where we've seen innovation and exciting areas of ICT development. But also, when I say ICT development, I mean helping with the development of the population by large through ICT solutions. And then countries like Mozambique, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the great growth prospects. So those are the countries that I'd keep an eye on for the next 2 to 3 years. And I say 2 to 3 years because in Africa, 2 to 3 years is a lifetime.
Now, I know that there's a real dichotomy in Africa as well. You've got a lot of the really exciting markets that you've talked about, but there's also a lot of countries that aren't doing nearly as well economically. And I was wondering if there are any real systematic differences you see between these two different categories of countries.
Yeah, Nick, what the question you're asking is an important one, because we tend to lump all these countries together as one. We think of Africa as one country, whereas Africa is the most diverse continent of all. It's got over 1,000 dialects. Ethnic differences and tribal differences really permeate and dominate the landscape. And if you're doing business in these places, you don't only have to understand politics and local politics, but you need to understand the power plays between these cultures and understand how to do this in a sub-regional way. So to really highlight this point, which are the countries that are not, in my mind, dynamic markets in Africa, and some of them are fast-growing markets, I would say that the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is probably one of the most exciting prospects, is one of those countries that will be, in the typical kind of Brazilian way, the country of the future, and it always will be. It has enormous potential in natural resources. Just about every metal or mineral that they have in the world is found in the ground in the DRC. It has a large population, a young population, but this is a country that is just plagued by politics, conflict, ongoing conflict, and that just boils over every now and then. And obviously, it is literally landlocked. It's got one small little opening, but that's one that is controlled by rebels, etc. And then obviously with this comes a difficult landscape that is not connected in terms of infrastructure or rail or any form whatsoever. So that is an example of one where we're seeing ongoing problems, and the human development factor in these countries is a big problem. The other one that I would say that is on the cusp of probably being a dynamic market, and it captures a huge amount of attention, but still needs to do a lot of work in the areas of governance and political transparency, is probably Angola. Angola was hailed to be one of the fastest growing economies in 2010, 2011, thereabouts. But Angola is just purely an oil exporting country. They make nothing, and an economy can only really and truly be dynamic and very progressive if they are manufacturing something that can be made or that can be bought by others and exported. And that is really adding to the true dynamism or the diversity of the economy. And then obviously I could go into a long story about the North African economies that are still battling their way out of the Arab Spring, because those two are obviously African countries, and they've got a long way to go before they can establish some type of social stability, and they can start having more progressive economic outcomes that was anticipated just about 3 or 4 years ago, before the Arab Spring ensued.
Now, we've talked a lot about the extremely rich natural resources in Africa, and now there's been a lot written also about the resource curse, where countries with these incredibly rich natural resources actually have a host of problems: wars, corruptions. Do you think that these factors are still something that African countries must avoid, or do you think they've largely learned from kind of the lessons of the past?
Obviously, this is something they must avoid, and hopefully some of the political leaders and the policymakers have learned from the past. But my fear is that Africa is still quite vulnerable. We saw that in 2010. I mentioned Mozambique earlier. In 2010, a subtle rise in bread prices brought about social unrest in the streets of Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, which led to the death of a number of people. And this is how quick something can change in Africa, and how vulnerable some of these African countries are. They don't have the institutional base, they don't have the institutional framework to help carry them forward. This is still in its infancy in Africa, and without institutions and without clear policies and better transparency, we're going to continue to suffer from these issues of perceived political risk, conflict, and social unrest many of the times. So with regard to the resource curse thing, I think this is still a very, very serious concern in Africa, especially as we are discovering more and more resources on the African continent. That is something that I think the rest of the world is only now starting to become aware of, is that in fact Africa has far more resources than what we even anticipated just 10 years ago. As conflicts have subsided and territories have become navigable, if you like, and people can explore these areas, we are seeing that these resources are prevalent, and it's going to be interesting to see how countries like Mozambique, Angola, as I mentioned earlier, Zambia, Tanzania, and some of these others, especially around that Central African Great Lakes area, manage their resources. Because the resource curse is one that requires very, very tight management and a more equitable flow of funds, because this is the big problem in Africa, is that it's perceived that the resources and the wealth of the resources have just flooded right out of the continent in the past.
Now, we've talked a little bit about how quickly things can change in Africa. You said 2 to 3 years is a lifetime. I was wondering, what are the few key things you think African countries must do in order to maintain this positive growth as it goes forward?
I think one of the 2 or 3 things I think would be to prevail now with the current kind of the progress that has taken place. This across the board embracing of a democratic ideology. Empirical evidence shows, and often in other parts of the world, whenever I give talks, I get asked this, whether autocracies and even dictatorships are better than democracies, because this is still a debate that goes on in Africa, surprisingly, and in Latin America and in Asia, because some countries, some autocracies have fared relatively well in Asia, where they've had a benign leadership. But empirical evidence does show that democracies deliver growth far better than what autocracies do. And this is across the board. And we can see this in many Latin American countries. Chile is the one that is most commonly used. In Africa, this is also the case. In Africa, under democracies, African countries have prospered. They've become more open and connected. And this is very, very important. So that is the first thing, is prevail with democratic ideology. I think the second point is to pursue policies, and especially economic policies, of openness and connectedness, and to really connect, because connect both within Africa and with the rest of the world. Individual African countries are basically irrelevant. If I ask you today, what is the size of Kenya? The Kenyan economy is probably the same size as Uruguay, but it is it's regarded as one of the economic lions of Africa, one of the great players on the African continent, but a relatively small economy. But the East African community, the regional bloc in which Kenya belongs, is a much larger bloc, a much bigger influence in the global economy, with leverage and much better economic prospects for outside investors, and really a kind of a gateway or a hub for East Asia to look into the rest of Africa. So connectedness is vital, and we need to create economies of scale on the African continent in that regard. And then finally, I would just say around management of economies and management of expectations. We have a continent that has got some of the greatest economic prospects for years to come. This is really the last frontier of economic development and economic growth. The last place where companies can really grow their market share exponentially. That is Africa. But by the same token, this is a severely underdeveloped region with very, very poor people. When you get off the aeroplane in Tet in northern Mozambique, you are blown away, not by the fact that this is the fastest growing town in the world literally at the moment, but by the fact that there is enormous poverty in this dust bowl. So we have this incredible dichotomy that has to be managed very, very carefully. So it's the management of the economy, of investors, and the expectations of the people as we drive forward.
Dr. White, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Nick.
That's all for this edition of CIBER Focus. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact us at ciber@indiana.edu.